Hey up campers, Johnny Matthew here. Welcome back to the blog. It is great to have you here. If you're new, welcome. If you've been before, welcome as well, of course. If you want to support the work, just nip over onto the text blog, click a blue button and buy me a pint. I think you can do it for a £5 or something like that. Anyway, you're welcome to this for nothing, of course. So this is the second post in... Well, I'm not sure how long the series will be. It might just be these two, but there is a possibility, given the whizzing going on in my brain currently, that there may be some more. I might do one on, barriers and promoters to trauma-informed working in agencies, because that's very much on my mind at the minute. But anyway, we will see. So last week the post was Trauma and Children with Learning Disabilities number 1. We looked at fundamentals. So today we're looking at Trauma and Children with Learning Difficulties number 2, How to Help. Introduction. Working with troubled kids has all kinds of complexities attached to it, none more so than when the child has a learning disability. Over the years, I've come across this a lot, but it still amazes me how complex it can be, especially when layered up with other factors like trauma. Whether that's one-off, episodic, kind of event-based trauma, or whether it's developmental trauma. In the last post, we looked a bit at how kids with learning disabilities, or LDs, can be affected by trauma, and some of the differences to bear in mind if we're going to avoid applying the same approaches we might use for normally developing children. In this post, we'll look at how we can approach our work of supporting traumatised kids with LDs and some practical ways we can orientate our practice to try and optimise the impact. Given the breadth of the subject, of course, as always, what follows is necessarily cursory, but please contribute your own thoughts by leaving a comment. I really value those. Not many people seem to do that, but I really value it. And certainly, if there's anything, observations and so on, you want to add to what I'm writing and saying here, please do that in the comments, and also ideas of things that you'd like us to cover in future. I'd be very grateful for those. Okay, how to support traumatised children with learning disabilities. The issues facing kids with LDs who also endure trauma are legion, and so are the challenges for those of us trying to help. Given the summary ideas listed in the previous post, here are a few thoughts on how we might approach our work in supporting these kids in a way that takes account of all this. As always, very much a list of things that strike me as I write, and therefore far from exhaustive. So 4 things to get us started. Understand this child's unique needs, use trauma-informed approaches, adapt therapeutic approaches, and collaborate with schools and education. So number 1, understand this child's unique needs. Every child with LDs has a unique combination of strengths and challenges. So practitioners should, firstly, understand the child's specific LDs and how this might be affecting their ability to process trauma. So things like speaking with parents, carers, educationalists and other colleagues who know the child well can really help, and focusing on the child's functioning before the trauma, if possible, can help us highlight the before and after effects of what happened. And then observe how the child expresses stress or fear, negative moods, disappointments, how they regulate affect, and all that kind of stuff, because that can differ from atypical responses, not least in expression, differ from typical responses rather. So they may be atypical responses in kids with LDs. Remember, nothing is perfectly generalizable. Every child is different before the trauma. So equally, every child's post-traumatic presentation is layered on top of that distinctiveness and is therefore uniquely unique in itself. So that's number one, understand this child's unique needs. Number two, use trauma-informed approaches. Now, this is a vast subject in itself, but suffice to say that trauma-informed care ensures that children feel safe, understood, and supported. So key principles include, and I'm going to mention 3 briefly: a developmental focus, safety, trustworthiness, and empowerment. Developmental focus. Taking account of how old the child is important, but how mature they are, even more so in my view. Make sure to distinguish between the two though. In the intervention planning phase, maturity is the thing that matters most, I think. Chronological years is one thing, how many times the kid has been around the sun, but it may not tell us how they should be functioning, because they may be stuck, not least because of the learning disability in itself, but also trauma will put the brakes on normative development as well. So having a developmental focus is key. Safety. Create predictable routines, boundaries, and environments to help children feel secure. Your own consistency of presentation and approach is central to this. Keep change to a minimum and you're well on your way. Number 3, trustworthiness. Be respectful, consistent, and transparent in your actions and communication. Follow through on what you say, always. If in doubt, listen, then listen some more, reflect back, and then listen again. I always think of it like this: it's their party, so we need to keep that in mind. And if we do, that'll really help put the brakes on any tendency to rush in and make assumptions. So developmental focus, safety, trustworthiness, and then lastly, in trauma-informed approaches, empowerment. Give children choices and involve them in decisions whenever possible. If in doubt, ask them what they'd prefer, what they think, etc. Coupled with the kind of active listening mentioned just now, this gives kids their voice. Particularly crucial when children with learning disabilities may struggle with communication anyway, not least verbal communication. So understand this child's unique needs, use trauma-informed practices. Number 3, adapt therapeutic processes. Standard trauma interventions will almost certainly need to be chosen and adapted to best fit children with learning disabilities. And I'm going to mention 3 things here just by way of example, and I'm by no means an expert in any of these. It was just a comment to try and illustrate the point. I'm going to mention art or play therapy, sensory integration techniques, and social stories and visual aids. So art or play therapy can help non-verbal children express, not least their emotions. Using non-directed approaches allows the therapist to learn from the child and avoids things like confirmation bias and the misreading of intentions and meanings. Now, when it comes to the interpretation of meaning of what kids have said, done, or expressed, again, let's work hard to let kids do this for us as much as possible. So rather than assume what a picture or a bit of play may mean, let's just reflect that back and try and gently encourage the child to tell us what they think it means. That will help if we can do that as much as possible. And jumping to conclusions, of course, is the enemy. So art or play therapy. Then sensory integration techniques. Now, these may help children with sensory processing challenges to self-regulate. Information from parents and carers can really help here too, of course. Always ask, what's worked previously in this situation? And then integrate and develop these into your work. Tactile techniques, movement, music and rhythm, breath work, etc. can all work with LDs too. So don't write these off, but don't rush in thoughtlessly either without properly assessing what might work for this child, or just doing it because you're most comfortable with that. Keeping the child's interoceptive inner world, that kind of sensory integration, subjective self, keeping that in mind will help. And then thirdly on this one, social stories or visual aids. These can be used to explain therapy concepts and processes, present ideas, posit responses, and or just provoke and encourage conversation. But it's a real skill. Suffice to say that some kids need a more tangential and or creative approach to explaining things and giving expression to what's going on for them. But this is worth the time and effort involved, as it feeds into safety, helps with engagement, builds trust, as well as ensuring that the ways we communicate fit the needs of each child. So that's number 3, adapt therapeutic processes. That's art and or play therapy, for example, sensory integration techniques, and social stories or visual aids. And then number 4 on kind of how we can sort of begin to support these kids, collaborate with schools and education. Trauma often affects children's ability to learn. We talked about this in the previous post around Louise Bombay's brilliant book around called Settling to Learn. So collaboration with teachers and other educational staff is critical. So I'm going to list 5 quick things here. Recognise that help here is two-way traffic. Look at how kids with LDs interact with peers, providing a safe space in school particularly, training educationalists to recognise trauma responses, and adjusting academic expectations to accommodate a child. So let's whiz through these quickly. Firstly, recognise that help is two-way traffic. We can all learn from each other, because this mission to help kids is a joint mission. So asking for help from educationalists particularly may give us valuable insight and information in our work, but it also may give us an in to offer help back in the other direction. Secondly, how kids with LDs interact with peers. Knowing this can provide valuable insights for the helping process. Teachers and school staff have unique insights into this. So smoothing the therapeutic process by introducing consistencies that dovetail with school, for example, is a great way of helping kids feel safe and at ease. You know, if a teacher says, this is the way I get their attention, this is the way I sort of gently guide them back on task if their attention has wandered, and using the stuff that works in school in our settings too can be brilliant. So that kind of, two-way traffic in and learning from education staff how kids deal with their peers is really valuable stuff. Number 3, providing a safe space in school. Safe spaces in school where kids can go to self-regulate can massively help. Of course, lots of special schools and schools with well-being units or well-being areas, pastoral areas, that kind of thing, will have these. But the child may not know about them, or may not have used them before, or kind of know how to access them, or maybe there's some kind of stigma attached. So if we can understand this by working with colleagues who know about and use these kind of facilities, that's really helpful. So, and just working hard to tap into every available resource can be a real promoter of recovery for these kids. Fourthly, training educationalists to recognise trauma responses, particularly in children with LDs. In my experience, some LDs teaching staff can, understandably, tend to assign behavioural and emotional responses to the LDs. I had one recently where it's just written off as being part of menstruation, for example. Now, whilst that may be true, there may be traumagenic influences in play too. Something may have happened out with the learning disability that is causing this. So to quickly assign it to the learning disability without thinking more broadly may mean we miss a trick. So raising awareness of that in school settings is a good place to start. And then lastly, on this collaboration with schools and education, adjusting academic expectations to accommodate the child, particularly the child's current emotional state. We encounter this a lot in our work using the trauma recovery model. You can download that free, by the way, at trmacademy.com. But often a child's presentation will regress. It kind of slip back as they start to deal with the hard stuff and begin processing trauma. And when this happens, the key is that our help must also adapt. We have to kind of slip back in what we do to embrace that kind of slightly regressed state that the child is in. But we also need to allow or to adjust academic expectations of the child, to make sure they meet their current capacity. They may, pre the trauma or when they're not feeling kind of activated and agitated, they may be able to perform quite well. If they're not performing quite well, and we know there's been some traumatic experience that they're now processing, we need to tailor our expectations, kind of curb those a little bit, just to be more gentle and tentative and supportive. And that's no more so the case than in school and academic performance. Because if we dial up the pressure in school, that's the last thing that the child needs if they're just beginning or they're in the throes of processing the trauma. So that's collaborate with schools and education, recognise it helps two-way, learn from peer interactions, providing safe spaces in schools, training educationalists to recognise trauma, and then adjusting academic expectations. There's a lovely quote, and you can see a picture, a quote slide in the text blog from Ignacio Estrada, who was a kind of quite creative entertainer and teacher, worked a lot in schools, I think in Mexico, but he dealt a lot with, he used kind of puppetry and ventriloquism and that kind of thing. And the quote says, if a child can't learn the way we teach, maybe we should teach the way they learn. And I love that. And that's a kind of principal foundation for everything we're talking about. So practical implications for practitioners. So these are quite broad stroke, but I want you to include them. So there are 4 bits here: holistic assessments, multidisciplinary support, educate parents and caregivers, and promote resilience. So I'll tackle these in turn now. So practical implications for practitioners. Number 1, holistic assessments. Social workers and other helping professions should assess both trauma history and LDs when working with children. Looking at either in isolation is clearly a waste of time. Now, of course, we may need to tap into some clinical support around that if we need a cognitive assessment or an OT assessment or a speech and language assessment, of course. But nevertheless, we need to do it. That kind of dual lens, looking at trauma history and the LDs, helps practitioners to do a couple of things. Firstly, understand the child's unique needs and challenges, and then secondly, identify gaps in support, such as unmet, educational or therapeutic needs. Whenever possible, i.e. when there's been an episodic or one-off trauma rather than a developmental one, we need to examine the before and after effects of it. How did this traumatic event change the child's presentation? What were they like before? What are they like now? What are the differences? And what does that tell us? That's a really good place to start. That approach will help avert the risk of the trauma defining the child in the adult's minds. And to help them recover to how they were before, we need to understand the impact of what's happened and then begin to try and help them ameliorate that and dial it back. This is more complex, of course, if the adults aren't aware of there having been a traumatic event, or the child maybe hits adolescence, pubescence, and then begins to process trauma that was more developmental. I've seen this a lot when kids hit pubescence, or actually in adults when they have their first child, when their experience of sexual abuse, for example, comes to the fore, and suddenly you realise you're dealing with a more developmental piece rather than a one-off episodic trauma. So if we're not aware of there having been a traumatic event, that's really complicated. And we're reliant then on noticing changes, sometimes over quite protracted time period, between the child's previous presentation and the changes that are now coming to the fore that were induced by what happened to them. But in either event, whether it's a known or an unknown trauma, or whether it's an episodic or a long-term trauma, assessing the whole child as broadly as possible is absolutely critical. That's why I've put that top of the list for these practical implications for practitioners. So holistic assessments. Number 2, advocate for multidisciplinary support. So children with LDs often require coordinated care across multiple systems. Blockers within and between different parts of the system make things worse for the child and harder for those of us who are trying to support them. So just 3 quick things on this one. advocate for even more individualised plans, particularly in education and healthcare settings. So a couple of things here. Temporary adjustment of plans and approaches may be necessary during a child's recovery process. We may need to tweak things while they're recovering. It's like the child's got bigger fish to fry at the moment. Let's not over obsess about what's happening in school or whether they're sticking to their, physio or speech and language treatment plan. The trauma is the big thing. That's what's bubbling up. Let's deal with that first. So adjust the plan temporarily to accommodate that. And work with nature and work with the child's willingness to engage. So temporary adjustment of plans. Reviewing plans in the light of a changed presentation is important too, and that'll help keep things up to date and relevant. And then adding the views of new disciplines to plans. That may yield a more rounded picture of the child, leading to a clearer view of what's going on and how to help. So alongside those things, we can collaborate with therapists, teachers, healthcare colleagues and caregivers to create a cohesive care plan. Tailoring everyone's expectation to the current needs of the child will ensure a smoother approach to the work. So whomever it is the child is seeing on whatever given day, we're all on the same page. That's really critical. And ensure access to services like speech therapy, occupational therapy, or other specific and or targeted help. More than most client groups, kids with LDs need robust and persistent advocacy. We can do this to help ensure that they get what they need. Fighting on their behalf and giving their voice a boost can be hard work, absolutely. But it's tremendously satisfying as well, particularly when you get a breakthrough and the child begins to access help that they need and you begin to see the progress. It's a lovely thing. So having as many relevant disciplines involved in the helping task ensures thoroughness and increases the likelihood of a successful outcome. So practical implication for practitioners, we've had number 1, holistic assessments. Number 2, advocate for multidisciplinary support. Number 3, educate parents and caregivers. Now, parents and caregivers may need guidance on how to support their child at home as things unfold. So here's just 3 quick things that we can do as practitioners. Teach caregivers about trauma, learning together, working together, and then thirdly, connect families with support groups or community resources. So teach caregivers about trauma responses. Teaching them about trauma responses and how they may differ in children with LDs. Helping parents to adjust their understanding of their own child in this way is a key part of aid in recovery. The child will need to be held safely at home during the treatment phase. Now, parents and carers are absolutely central to this. So any time that we spend educating, supporting and helping them really is time well spent. So teach caregivers about trauma. Secondly, learning together, working together. Parents spend significantly more time with their kids than we do, obviously. So, for example, providing strategies for calming and supporting the child during meltdowns or distress, particularly in the trauma treatment phase when they're processing, can really help soothe the home environment and hold the child more effectively as they recover. But of course, any insights gained by practitioners that may help in the home and vice versa. So stuff that parents and carers in the home learn that can help us need to be shared really freely and form part of an ongoing, regular, two-way conversation where key adults are constantly learning from each other in that kind of trial and error nature of the process. So teach carers about trauma, learning together, working together, and then lastly on this one, connect families with support groups or community resources. Peer support during tough times can be a massive help. Parents and carers may not be aware of local opportunities to plug into the support that other individuals and families can provide. Now, whether these be in-person groups, WhatsApp groups, or other online resources of some kind, cutting through the isolation is always a good thing. And doing some of the work for parents and carers and making them aware of what's out there can be a big help. It kind of provides that first step, a kind of leg up to what might be a really helpful part of the process. So that's educate parents and carers. And then lastly, number 4, promote resilience. Building resilience is a key goal for all traumatised kids. There's a quote here from a great paper that I read yesterday by Anna Goddard. There's a link to it in the text blog. Quote, resilience is a multi-dimensional concept which in simple terms is defined as, here's the bit, positive adaptation and competence while facing adversity, unquote. So often children with LDs, especially those exposed to developmental trauma, will not have experienced the ordinary magic of being held within a lovely family, where adults are attentive, affectionate, and alive to their problems and needs. So basically they haven't learned how to ride over, and learn from the inevitable bumps in the road that come along from time to time. And this is what ordinary magic is, which is a link to Anne Maston's excellent book on resilience in development. The ordinary magic being we grow in a positive environment where through trial and error we learn and we grow, and there's positives and negatives, and the positives are praised and the negatives are held safely, and we learn from them, we assimilate that, and we move on. And that cyclical nature of trial and error, try, fail, respond, succeed, that's what builds in resilience. If we don't know what to do in a crisis situation, the first thing we do is draw on a generalized sense that we've got through things before, we've overcome barriers previously, and we'll probably be able to do it again. That's the kind of essence of resilience. It's not a built-in right stuff that kids have inevitably. Far from it. It's something they learn as they go along. So we need to kind of help that, particularly where kids haven't learned from those bumps in the road because of the setting they've been in. So how can we do that? 3 quick things. Firstly, encouraging caregivers to focus on the child's strengths and achievements. Balancing the problem focus with strengths, achievements, and positives is powerful, and it can lend real hope and encouragement to what can feel like an arduous and slow process at times. Secondly, facilitating positive peer relationships. That can be done through group activities, play dates, involvement in settings where kids with LDs can get together. Now, aside of the obvious benefits to the child and their parents or carers, being present at such times, being present at such times can help provide professionals with valuable insights into the child and their current functioning. It's a bit like drawing on teachers' insights as to how kids develop in peer settings. All of that feeds back in to the assessment and intervention planning to best meet needs and tailor the support as effectively as we can. And then thirdly, teaching coping skills. Things like deep breathing, mindfulness, tactile expression in ways that the child can understand. Now, somatic or body-based approaches like these can be really helpful in slowing down the physiological aspects of trauma activation, that kind of hypervigilance, agitation, anxiety, panic attacky kind of stuff. And doing that helps the child to be calmer in the moment and take fuller advantages of the opportunities around them. Just a word of caution here, we all need to be working within our skill set and qualifications here and not overreach, of course. This kind of work is not a place for experimenting with techniques that we're not qualified in properly. It can cause more problems than solutions if we do that. Okay, so that was practical implications for practitioners, holistic assessments, multidisciplinary support, educate parents and carers, promote resilience. So final thoughts. When trauma and learning disabilities meet inside the unique personality of a child, it presents challenges for those of us trying to help. But with the right input and help, children can be supported very successfully to overcome these barriers and fulfill more of their potential than they would otherwise. Most of us have accumulated a range of skills, techniques, and knowledge during our careers. The challenge here, though, is how to apply all that to the needs of this particular child. And keeping this perspective front and central is, certainly in my view, the key principle of all this, that by understanding the unique needs of traumatised children with learning disabilities, practitioners can advocate with confidence and hang in there when the going and the funding, let's face it, gets tough, to ensure that these kids receive the care and compassion they need. I absolutely really believe that with patience, creativity, collaboration, and a truly trauma-informed approach, we can help children move beyond their challenges and build brighter futures. I really hope that's useful. Guys, I will look forward to seeing you in the next one. Cheers.